Hello loves and welcome to today's video. I've seen a lot of people recently talking about authors that you didn't know were Canadian. So today I'm going to be giving you a list of some of my favorite Canadian authors, books that by Canadian authors that are my favorite. All of these are authors I would recommend outside of them being Canadian and just books that I enjoyed in general that happen to be by Canadians. The first author I own all of these books from, so you can tell is a favorite, and that is Mona Awad, who is a Canadian. So we have Bunny. This is about our main character Samantha, who is in like a writing program at university, and the other people in her cohort are like kind of culty, and they're the bunnies, and there's some magical realism going on in here. There's something weird with the bunnies. We have All's Well by Mona Awad. This is about a university teacher in the drama department who really wants to put on a specific Shakespeare play, but she also suffers from chronic pain. So it is her trying to do this play while coping with her chronic pain, and she goes to some weird lengths to try and cope. 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl. This is a series of vignettes about this teenager into adulthood who considers herself fat and how that impacts her relationships and her way of viewing herself through her adult life. And we have Rouge. This is about our main character who is like absolutely obsessed with her skincare routine, and when her mother's dies, she has to go down to LA to clean out her mother's, I think, like fashion designer store. She gets really obsessed with this specific spa, and there's something sinister going on there. All of these are by Mona Awad, all of these Canadian. I would say Bunny is my favorite of these. I know some people have mixed opinions about some of the other ones, but all of these were really entertaining, and Mona Awad is definitely one of my favorite authors of all time and just happens to be Canadian. Next, we have, I'm gonna flub this pronunciation even though I just listened to it like 6 times in a row, Waubgeshig Rice. He is the author of the White Sky Saga, which is like an apocalypse series about a remote Northern Ontario community where one day the internet goes out, the phones go out, power goes out, and they have to try and cope without these modern luxuries they've come to be reliant on. But because it is a largely Indigenous community, they fare better than others. And then they find out that it's not just their community that's been cut off, it's the entirety of the world, Canada. It's an apocalypse story, it's a survival story. I really enjoyed this, even though usually survival apocalypse stories aren't my favorite. I prefer like post-apocalypse. I thought this was a really interesting perspective on this type of story, and I would definitely recommend it. My third recommendation is Emma Donaghue. I haven't read all of Emma Donaghue's stuff because there is a lot of it. The books that I have read from Emma Donaghue so far, I have really enjoyed. That includes Haven, which is about these monks who are trying to find pure place to live, so they move to this very remote island, and then they face some struggles because they're like 3 monks on an island trying to survive against the weather. I thought this was really interesting. Twist on that survival story again, because it is one of the guys being like, well, God will provide for us as long as we are pure, and the other two being like, okay, but like, can we maybe find something to eat and put in the work? Emma Donaghue also wrote Room, which I did read last month. This is about a woman and her little son who are kidnap victims. Her son has never left this singular room because he was born there. He's lived there his whole life. It is told from the boy's perspective, so you get a really interesting perspective on the world from someone who's never experienced the world outside of a singular room and the television. I also own this one, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. This is Learned by Heart by Emma Donaghue. This is a love story between a heiress turned orphan and the tomboy that they meet at their boarding school. Definitely going to be moving this up my list because I did really enjoy Room, which I read recently, and I want to enjoy some more Canadian authors, so this one exists. I can't tell you if it's good or not yet. Next, we have William Gibson, who is like sometimes credited as the father of the cyberpunk genre. So this is Neuromancer, Count Zero, Mona Lisa Overdrive, and Burning Chrome. Burning Chrome is a short story collection, and Neuromancer is considered to be like one of the first ever cyberpunk novels. I think he invented the term cyberspace. Like, that is how important he is to the genre of cyberpunk. Neuromancer, I read a while ago now, but it is a cyberpunk story about this guy who has to steal some chip or something. It's been a while, I don't remember exactly, but very critical to the development of the cyberpunk genre. I know William Gibson has a lot more other books that I haven't read yet. I do own them, I just haven't read them yet, but cyberpunk is a Canadian genre. Next, if you're more into like dark romance, not so much sci-fi, we have Brynne Weaver, who wrote the Ruinous Love trilogy, Butcher and Blackbird, Leather and Lark, and Scythe and Sparrow. So Butcher and Blackbird is about these two serial killers who accidentally try and kill the same person, and then they decide to make it like an annual thing where they pick a target and whoever kills them first gets to claim the kill, and it's the two of them fall in love during that. Leather and Lark is about the female serial killer's best friend, who is also a multiple deleter, and the like mob cleanup guy, who is the brother of the serial killer from the first one, and them falling in love. Scythe and Sparrow is the third one. It is about the third brother and a woman from the circus. I have not read this one yet. It only came out a couple weeks ago, so if you are a dark romance girly, this series is great, and all of my tabs in Leather and Lark are just for Keanu Reeves references, who is another Canadian, so I recommend this series, especially if you're a Keanu Reeves fan. If you're more into contemporary and not so dark romance, I would recommend the books of Ruby Barrett. Ruby Barrett is a Canadian romance author. She has a few different books so far. So the ones that I have are The Romance Recipe. This is about a woman who owns a restaurant and a chef, and the restaurant owner sees the chef on like a competition cooking show and is like, I need her for my restaurant. Drunk slides into the DMs to be like, can I hire you? They work together to build up this restaurant while also falling in love and trying to keep their personal relationship and their work relationship separate. We have The Friendship Study. This is about Lulu and Jesse. Jesse used to be a firefighter, and then he was injured and had to no longer have that job. And Lulu just returned to her hometown after having a bad toxic relationship in the UK. They both are having trouble finding friends in their new situation, so they join this university study called the Friendship Study to try and figure out how to make adulthood friends. One of the rules of the study is that you cannot be in a romantic relationship with anyone in the study, and so they have to come up with some creative ways to skirt the rules since they are attracted to each other. The most recent release from Ruby Barrett is The Matchmaker. Haven't read this one yet. This is about a woman who uses a matchmaker service to try and find love. She gets matched up with Nick. She convinces him to pretend that he is her boyfriend to like get back at her ex-fiance. He asks her to repay the favor, so this is like fake dating. Haven't read it yet, but based on how much I loved these two, these are probably my favorite romance of all time. I'm really hoping that I like this one as well. So if you want some contemporary romance, I recommend this author, Ruby Barrett. If you prefer your romance a little more literary, or you're just looking for something literary in general, or something that plays with format, which we all know is my favorite, This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. Amal El-Mohtar is a Canadian, and this is about a time war where there are two opposing sides, red and blue, who are traveling back and forth in time to different places to try and win this time war. And red and blue are two soldiers in this front who are leaving notes for each other of like, hey, got here first. And then through these letters back and forth, they end up falling in love. So beautifully written, and also a love story. So if you want something literary and lovely, definitely recommend this. I know Amal El-Mohtar just came out with a new release that's more in the fantasy genre. Haven't read that yet. I'm waiting on my Libby loan, but definitely do recommend This Is How You Lose the Time War. Next on this list is one that actually surprised me that this was a Canadian, and that is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kliewer. So this is a horror novel about this woman who just bought this house. They're gonna fix it up and flip it, and their lesbian partner. One day this family shows up on her doorstep like, hey, we used to live here. Can I show my kids around my childhood home? And she really doesn't want to say yes, but then she does say yes, and then they just overstay their welcome, like by a lot, and weird things start happening. This one also has a really interesting ARG element to it if you want to deep dive, if you want to dig into all the lore behind it. I haven't, but just as a standalone book, as a horror, I really enjoyed this one. It really gives you the feeling of House of Leaves, but with a bit less of a confusing format. So if you wanted to get into House of Leaves but wanted to try something not quite as complicated, this is such a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. Plus, lesbians. I love a horror with lesbians. Staying in the horror genre, we also have Silvia Moreno-Garcia. So this is more of a gothic horror. So Mexican Gothic, which is about a woman who goes to visit her cousin in like a manor in Mexico. Things are weird in this home. I've also read Silver Nitrate, which is about this horror director who stopped making films because his last film like summoned a demon. These are definitely really steeped in Mexican culture while also being from a Canadian author, which I think is really cool because I think it really highlights the diversity of perspectives that come from Canadians. And I think the horror is really good in this one, especially if you prefer more gothic horror book versus a more overt splatterpunk. Silvia Moreno-Garcia, Canadian author. Also another horror author I didn't realize was Canadian is Nick Cutter, who I think also writes under a different name, Craig Davidson. And I didn't so much like the Craig Davidson book I read, but I did love The Troop by Nick Cutter. This is about like a Boy Scout troop who goes to this island to go camping, and then people start getting sick and keeling over. And so you have this Boy Scout troop who is trying to figure out what's going on with the people who are dropping dead. This one got gross at times, so warning of that. Again, if you want less gross gothic horror, Mexican Gothic. This was gross horror, and I loved it. It was so interesting. So definitely recommend The Troop by Nick Cutter. Haven't read any of the other Nick Cutters yet, but they're on my TBR. You can't bring up Canadian authors without talking about Bryan Lee O'Malley, because Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is just so Canadian. Very specifically Toronto. If you've ever watched the movie, if you've ever read the comics, there's just so many Toronto institutions that are critical to that setting. It's not in the movie, but it is in the book that there's like a fight that goes down in Honest Ed's. There's the iconic Pizza in the background, Lee's Palace, just so Toronto. And I've never lived in Toronto because I don't like Toronto that much, but that makes me like Toronto just a tad. Any appreciation I have for Toronto comes from enjoying Scott Pilgrim. If you're looking for a graphic novel series, I definitely recommend Scott Pilgrim. And I couldn't wear this shirt and not mention that Keanu Reeves has a comic book series called Berserker. This is about B, who is immortal, can't die. You rip his head off, he's gonna regrow it. And he has been alive for thousands of years and is currently hooked up with a military organization who is trying to investigate where he came from to, I don't know, make more of him. So I really enjoyed the original Berserker comic book series. I obviously have these fancy editions of them, but they do have collected volumes if you prefer those. Based on this character, Keanu Reeves collaborated with China Millville to write a novel. This I am mentioning as an honorable mention because China Millville is not Canadian and did the majority of the writing, but Keanu Reeves was the world builder. So this also, with this, if you enjoyed this, read that. And my last three recommendations are all going to be memoirs if you wanted more non-fiction about the Canadian experience. First one is Resilience is Futile, The Life and Death and Life of Juliette Lalonde, obviously by Juliette Lalonde. This is about Juliette Lalonde, who is a women's rights activist who was stalked in her teen to 20 years, and she really processes how stalking is approached by law enforcement, how it really impacts and digs into every aspect of your life, and how even after the worst of it has ended, it still can impact you for the rest of your life. Julie also talks a lot about how resilience is futile, that no matter how strong you are, how resilient you are, these things still impact you, and trying to be strong doesn't necessarily get you any further. So I really loved this. I bought 2 copies of this just to have one to lend out to people because it was so amazing. So definitely recommend this. Next, we have Son of Elsewhere, a memoir in pieces by Elamin Abdelmahmoud. His family emigrated to Canada when he was 12 years old from Sudan. This memoir really looks at the identity of Blackness within Canada. While we don't have that same history that the United States does, there are still racist institutions within Canada, and this really looks at that through the lens of pop culture, which I thought was a really interesting way to connect with the story. I loved all of the pop culture references in here, and it was also great to read from a different perspective. That is not one that I've necessarily read a lot or seen a lot or heard from a lot. So if you wanted something that looks at the experience of being Black within Canada, I thought this one was a really good and approachable book. And the last book on this list is Valley of the Birdtail by Douglas Anderson and Andrew Stobo Sniderman. This is a, again, nonfiction history of a specific town that was near a Indigenous reserve, and how the experience of the white immigrants within this town were treated compared to the Indigenous peoples who have been on that land for generations. I thought that this was a very good first introduction to how Canada has historically treated its Indigenous peoples, and the way that it framed the comparisons between the Indigenous peoples and the white immigrants really helps put into perspective that makes it accessible to newer generation Canadians to proactively address the arguments of like, well, my parents came here with nothing but the clothes on their back and they were able to build themselves up. So while a lot of this video has been supporting Canadians, I really wanted to include this one because I don't want to just seem like rah rah, Canada is the best. Canada has its own problems, Canada has its own troubling past and history, and we can support Canadian authors while still acknowledging that. That's why I wanted to include some memoirs on this list that address not necessarily the best parts of being Canadian, but some of our darker parts as well, but in a way that is approachable, that is from a place of education, while also being entertaining reads. I enjoyed reading them. They weren't super dry textbooks like some other thing I've tried to read. These are a lot of Canadian recommendations. Honestly, I was surprised I had this many, so many that I can't hold on my shelves already, and that I didn't have to dig very deep to find some Canadian authors and Canadian books that I absolutely love. So I hope that you will give some of these Canadian authors a try. Let me know in the comments down below if there's any Canadian authors that you love, any books about the Canadian experience, or if you're not American, what are some of the favorite authors you have from your own country? Or just leave the maple leaf or Canadian flag in the comments so I know you made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, like and consider subscribing so you don't miss any more of my book recommendations. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.